Amid considerable uncertainty for the global economy and financial markets, Treasurer Jim Chalmers has delivered Budget 23-24. Joining me to discuss the key assumptions, figures, and also the intent behind government policy is our Westpac Group Chief Economist, Bill Evans. Bill, welcome.
Nice to be here, Elliot. You gave me a pretty broad set of issues to talk about, and I'm pleased you did, because there are a number of really important aspects of this budget. The first one, from my perspective, is that the gross debt to GDP ratio back in October was peaking around 47%. This time it's peaking at 36.3%, and in the out years it's down to 32%. So that's a 15% of GDP reduction in our debt position. That's an extraordinary achievement, and obviously it's due to the very strong starting point that we had for this budget: stronger inflation, stronger employment, and much better commodity prices. We were very pleased with our budget preview, where we estimated that the starting point would improve relative to October by the equivalent of 136 billion. In fact, it improved by 146 billion. The total new deficits after all policy is 126 billion. So they started off being ahead 146 billion, and after all their policies, they're still ahead by 126 billion. So the Treasurer will quite rightly say that he protected most of the improved starting position. The problem is that 20 billion, because that 20 billion is distributed 12 billion in the first year, 5 billion in the second year, and about 3 billion in the third year. So this is the increased spending over those 3 years. Now, when we look at the share of GDP in previous budgets, the proportion of GDP in the first year has been a maximum of 0.25%. This is 0.5%. Over the 3 years, it's been a maximum of 0.5%. This is nearly 0.8. So when we look at the actual new spending in the budget, relative to the 10 years before COVID, it is almost twice as strong as we've seen in the past. So people will argue that this is a big spending budget.
Interesting. So you mentioned there we had a much better starting point as a result of commodity prices, the strength of the labour market, and you also then mentioned new spending. When we look at that profile and going from surplus in the current financial year to deficits again, is your read that that's coming as a result of what was tailwinds becoming headwinds, or is this a result of this new spending that you're talking about?
Well, it's a combination of both. So the starting points were also much worse than in the 22-23, but more importantly, we had that extra 12 billion of spending, net spending in 23-24. And so that's what started off the run of much larger deficits. But as I say, the improved position of 146 billion, they managed to save most of it. So it's still 126 billion. So that's an achievement, but 20 billion going into the economy in the space of 3 years is what I would call big spending.
We know from our consumer sentiment survey that people have been quite concerned about cost of living pressures. How has the government responded in this budget to that sort of threat, I suppose, to spending and to people's perceptions of their family finances?
Oh, look, I think that as was clearly signalled before tonight, that's where all the emphasis is. So the big spending components, 5.6 billion to improve Medicare, trebling of the bulk billing incentive for doctors for certain patients, young patients, older patients, 4.6 billion to increase job seeker and youth payments. So that was a surprise. We only expected it to go to people over 55. They're getting an extra $90, but the others are getting an extra $40. But 4.6 billion is a big number. Then 2.7 billion for rental assistance and 1.9 billion for single parents, so that they continue to get the benefit until the child gets to age 14 rather than age 8 at the moment. They are the four really big initiatives in the budget that are addressing that cost of living issues. And of course, in our own economic forecasts, the weakness, the theme for the next couple of years is going to be very weak consumer spending, and this may in some way help to alleviate that.
So I think then more broadly, I suppose, thinking about businesses, I mean, a key concern for businesses being the cost of doing business and also the capacity of the economy, whether it be to get new staff they need or the inputs they need into production. Are there sort of measures in this budget which are looking at the efficiency of business, the productivity of business, and trying to improve that?
Look, there were a couple of what I would call not very expensive items, such as reducing the indexation on your tax payments for small business from 12% down to 6%. There was a full asset write-off of up to $20,000 for the next year. So a couple of small initiatives for business, but it really was a budget focused on helping the household sector. The one that I was pleased about is that the problem the Australian economy is facing is lack of productivity growth. And we know how threatening that is to inflation. Because if wages growth is running at 4% and you have negative productivity growth, businesses have to raise their prices by 5%. We normally think about productivity growth of 1 to 1.5%, meaning businesses only have to raise their prices by 2.5%. And one of the most important contributors to productivity is infrastructure. So what the government has done is that they are going to take a look at the $120 billion infrastructure pipeline that they've inherited from the previous government, with an eye to see whether some changes can be made, some reallocations can be made, with an eye to improve that productivity story.
Okay. Also, there's a few kind of smaller measures around small business to try and improve their, or entice them into greater investment with the asset write-off, as well as the additional measures around trying to be more energy efficient, electricity, greater use of that in the business to actually improve our kind of, I guess, impact on the environment as well, which is quite promising.
Yeah, so the incentive for electrification amongst small business was to be welcomed.
Now, last week we had the RBA meet and they did decide to raise rates again, and that was despite the deceleration we have been seeing in terms of inflation over the last couple of months. In terms of the take home from this budget, does it sort of change in the way we and the RBA might perceive the risks that the economy faces going forward?
I don't think it'll threaten the near term. Really what we're saying is that $12 billion is going to be spent in the 23-24 year. The near term is what happens at the August board meeting. So we don't think that they'll see a reason to move, and I don't think there's anything in this budget that would make them go, oh, look at the budget, we have to raise rates. Where it will threaten the issues will be the timing at which we see the beginning of the rate cuts. So we've currently got February almost in the middle of that 23-24 year when that $12 billion is going to be going into the economy. So if there was to be a change in our view on interest rates, it would be putting some question mark over the timing of that rate cut, rather than saying that this is going to mean that the RBA will look at that $12 billion and go, oh, we have to raise rates now. They'll want to wait to see the impact, because part of that $12 billion is being used to lower energy costs, and the government's saying it's actually going to be deflationary. Obviously, if you lower someone's energy costs, that produces more money for them to spend elsewhere, which can boost demand and can put inflation pressures elsewhere. So we don't know the answer to that until we see it play out. RBA won't be raising rates in anticipation of that $12 billion, but it could mean that over that course of that year, that the opportunity to cut rates as early as February starts to fade away. That's the one thing I'm worried about with regard to the budget. So I think you'll find there'll be a lot of nervous Nellies out there that'll say this is an inflationary budget and the RBA will have to go and raise rates very soon. No, that's not how I read the budget. I read it more as a threat to the timing of the first rate cut.
That's very interesting. Well, thank you again, Bill, for a very insightful assessment of the budget just on release. Can I also commend to our viewers to head along to Westpac IQ and take a look at the full bulletin which we provide, giving all the detail on the budget as well. That's available now at Westpac IQ. We'll see you again soon.